Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another video. Today is day numero 10 of the 14-day video a day challenge for the month of June. And before we get on to the topic for today's discussion, I want to give a very big shout out to every single one of y'all who watched my previous discussion on Zelda Breath of the Wild. For a video that I just put up there talking about a 2-year-old game, I was surprised to see how much it resonated with not only my community but so many new subscribers out there. So thank you guys so much for watching that video. If you're tuning in for the very first time after that video and you're wondering what to expect from this channel, well, I'm a simple dude who likes to chill, hang out, turn on the camera, and have these long-winded discussions. I think that's pretty much what I'm known for here on YouTube. And we're going to do that today. Tonight, we are going to be talking about E3, or at least the aftermath of E3 2019. Now, it should come as no shock to anybody that when it comes to E3, for the majority of people on here, it holds a very special place in our hearts, especially on our yearly calendars, because E3 is essentially like Christmas. I think everybody will agree to that. Even though technically you don't get any gifts when you watch E3, it's more often than not games you're not going to be playing for the next year or two. And in some cases, you'll be seeing those same games for 3 E3s in a row. It's just insane how it works out. But one thing that we've noticed in particular about E3s, at least in the past couple of years, is that they really haven't been as exciting as they were with previous, I guess, trade show events. We started to notice some shifts in the industry in terms of the way companies would go about delivering content and information to you, the consumer. So when we're talking about the subject of E3, the big elephant in the room is E3 still relevant? As we've seen this year, we had one of the major players, that being PlayStation, simply not show up to E3 at all. They had no conference. They didn't even have any presence last time I checked. They didn't even have any booths for games that they wanted to play. Correct me if I'm wrong down below in the comment section. But that is pretty major and monumental. And there are so many think pieces that people have done as to why PlayStation decided not to show up at E3 this year. But one thing that we did notice for the people that did show up to E3, none of their stuff was really that exciting. With the exception of 2 companies, Square Enix and Nintendo, most of the companies played it safe. Now, that's not to say that the games that they showed off were bad or they were regurgitations of what we've seen before. No, in some situations, these companies have announced new products, but none of them are really that exciting, if you will. And I know this has pissed a lot of people off because, they're just wanting to see more new games after new games after new games. But what I think a lot of people have to realize is that this is the second to last E3, the final full year without a next generation console. As crazy as it sounds, the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Scarlet, and the Switch Pro, more likely than not, are going to be hitting store shelves within the next 18 months. Now, the reason why I say it's so crazy is because this generation, by the time those new consoles come out, will have hit 7 years. And it's so surreal when you think about it, considering that's the exact amount of time the last generation was. 7 years. Technically 8 if you count the Xbox 360's year head start. 7 years. But why does this generation feel like it's gone by so much faster compared to last gen? If you look at last generation's final E3 before the next gen consoles hit, for the full year, I'm not talking about literally the conference right before they came out. It was E3 2012. And as I'm sure you guys noticed, 2012, at least for announcements and expectations, was a pretty bummer year when it shouldn't have been, considering we had a brand new Nintendo console coming out, the Wii U, and most of the systems had already hit their stride. So we were supposed to be getting the swan songs of the generation. And with the exception of something like The Last of Us, more often than not, what we got as far as the exclusives were just retreads. We had God of War Ascension come out, didn't really set the world on fire. We had Gears of War Judgment come out, didn't really set the world on fire. And there was just something that we noticed with that generation, is that a lot of people were just tired of it. They were ready to move on to greener pastures. And it's so interesting because back then, the reason why I thought was because the generation for the first time in a long time had gone on longer than most, because most console generations relatively last 4 to 5 years, maximum maybe 6, but that's stretching it. This was the first generation because of the advent of online that you could prolong it. But I don't think any of the companies were really ready. So the games that they were putting out around the time, they were making it with the mindset of the games that came before. Nowadays, when you have games that are supported for years upon years, and when you have games that cost a lot more and they take longer to develop, I think there's a reason why this generation feels shorter. It's not because it is shorter, it's because it took a long time for these systems to get off the ground. If I'm being real with y'all, this generation, in my opinion, didn't start getting like really good. Like, yeah, I definitely need to buy a next gen system until 2015, pushing it to 2016. Now, I know a lot of people will probably argue with me on that, referencing one game here, one game there. But come on, guys. Most of those great games people were talking about were cross-generation titles. So, hypothetically speaking, you didn't need a new console to play it. PlayStation 4 didn't really have a must-have exclusive in terms of you could only get this type of game on a next-gen system until Bloodborne. And that was in spring of 2015. And that's okay, because again, if we're adopting the old console mindset, it takes a while for these developers to work on these games and put out their great masterpieces. And of course, with newer generation hardware, it'll take even longer. Making games and outputting them at sub HD resolution, going to the PlayStation 4 in 1080p and doing stuff like 60 frames per second, not all the time, and all the particle effects that go with it, it was a pretty big jump. But you want to know what's even more interesting surrounding it and why we're getting a lot of these games later in the generation and why we're seeing a lot of these developers only putting out maybe 1 or 2 games this gen compared to like 3 to 4 last gen. I honestly believe that this fatigue not only affected the consumers, but it also affected the developers. Because look at what people were talking about in late 2011, going into 2012, and even early 2013. Gaming, traditional gaming, is going to die in favor of smartphones and mobile. All that stuff is going to take over the way you play, that consoles would be obsolete. I remember a ton of people coming out here and saying that smartphone gaming would kill Nintendo. The 3DS would die. It'd be dead on arrival. And while the 3DS did suffer in the beginning, I don't think that was because of smartphones. The 3DS was a meteoric success. Of course, it wasn't the same as the DS, considering the uphill battle the 3DS had in the beginning. And, generally kids nowadays would rather play on a smartphone than a dedicated console. It still did exceptionally well, especially when Nintendo dropped that 2DS. But that's a Nintendo handheld. A lot of people know what they're good for. What about the consoles? People assume that consoles would die. So what do? They start focusing on the mobile games, or they start focusing on the always online PC experiences. And we saw this with many companies. So many companies. But what happened? The PlayStation 4 launched, broke all these crazy records. You start seeing all the exclusive games that didn't really sell well on PS3 sell crazy on PS4. You have a lot of developers scrambling. Why do you think we got so many remasters within the first 2 years of the generation? Because a lot of these developers probably believed that console gaming wouldn't be viable anymore. Which is why the only thing that they could put out were these remasters that took less than a year, and it cost them little to no money, while they crafted their experiences. And what happened? We saw these games come out within the middle of the generation, and we were just floored by them. Absolutely floored. Compared to last generation, when all these developers had their stuff out within the first 2 years. Compare the first 2 years of last generation to this generation. Last generation, the first 2 years, we had games like BioShock, games like Dead Space, games like Gears of War, games like Uncharted. Compared to this generation, we had a couple of third-party gems, such as Wolfenstein, The Evil Within. We had some good games such as Sunset Overdrive. But the real heavy-hitting quality of this generation didn't come until 2015, 2016, 2017. And since we're on the topic of PlayStation, every single year since 2015 has been an absolute banger for PlayStation. Bloodborne, Uncharted 4, Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, Death Stranding, and then you got Ghost of Tsushima and Last of Us Part 2. Like, that's insane. That is absolutely insane. So for a lot of people assuming that, Sony was cooling by this generation, well, yeah, they were cooling by. They didn't put out as many games as they did last gen, but for good reason. Because they focused on the quality of those games and making them powerhouses that sold triple, quadruple what their PlayStation 3 counterparts did with a smaller install base at the time. That's what it's all about. So why did I do this? Why did I spend 11 minutes talking about the way last generation was in comparison to this generation, and why this year's E3 might seem kind of paltry? Well, it's not really paltry. It isn't. Because a lot of these developers have kind of learned from their mistakes. They learned that maybe we don't need to crank out another sequel to this just because we can. Maybe we can invest that time in a new IP, or make this a game with the next generation in mind. Maybe make it a cross-generational title as well, because unlike the PS3 going into the PS4, the gap between the PS4 and the PS5 is not going to be as big. Even though they're going to tout it as such, the games are still going to be playable and they're going to look somewhat identical. Between PS3 and PS4, for a lot of the games, the further time got on, it wasn't comparable at all. So this leads me to believe that a lot of these developers, they're holding back because of the next generation, because they don't want to be caught with their tail between their legs and announcing all this stuff because they assume the PS3 would be the last system that they could really make bank off of, and they have to do all these mobile games. Nope, not at all. So that's why this year at E3, we didn't really see too many new IP announcements. We saw a couple. Don't get it twisted. I'm not going to sit here and say we didn't. But to the extent that a lot of people were expecting, especially after banger after banger after banger after banger, coming off of 2017, which was arguably one of the best years in all of gaming history, going into 2018, which was still pretty good, and in 2019, where, we have a couple of gems here like Resident Evil 2 Remake, but nothing is really hitting like it's supposed to. Big games such as Anthem, for obvious reasons, and the business practices and all that. But all of that stuff feeds into this notion that E3 is somehow not relevant. Because since Sony didn't show up, the reason why Sony didn't show up, we can theorize all we want on why they didn't show up. A lot of people assume it's because they have nothing to show because they've been showing the same games for years after years. Sony learned from Nintendo. Sony learned that they could literally show up on a Tuesday afternoon, drop a trailer for Death Stranding, it'll get 6 million views. Why would they need to rent out space for an E3 conference and do that exact same thing when they can just upload a trailer and it can just set the internet on fire? What company basically pioneered that sort of thing? Nintendo. At least in a major scale where everybody's noticing it. I'm sure other companies have had their little things here and there, but the way that Nintendo does it, other companies have taken notice, Microsoft actually, correct me if I'm wrong, they did something similar to that like before Nintendo, but then they stopped it for a bit because it didn't gain any traction, and then they brought it back up again. That's where the industry is going. Delivering the content to you on their terms. Because you want to know why? It manufactures exclusivity. Because now all eyes are going to be on them, ironically, by them not being there. It's really interesting when you think about it, and this is just my speculation behind it. I don't know the exact reason why Sony did that. Maybe the reason why they're doing it is because they want to prep everything for the PS5, because we know they're going to be back there next year, most likely. But PlayStation Experience, that was one way of handling things on their own terms, not on E3. similar to when Nintendo used to do Space World back in the day. So if Sony does show up at E3 2020, most likely they will, because they'll be talking about the PlayStation 5 and they'll probably bring back PlayStation Experience as well. Will so many people say that E3 is still not relevant? I don't know. I feel like the reason why people are saying this is because one of the major presents isn't there and they're not getting a lot of new announcements. I'm sorry, guys. It's kind of the end of the generation, so what do you expect? Now, it's looking like it's going to be an amazing end of the generation with games like Cyberpunk, Final Fantasy VII Remake, all the Nintendo titles, Ghost of Tsushima, Last of Us Part 2. It's looking like it's going to be an amazing final run. But to say that E3 is not relevant, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of an ignorant statement. I mean, yeah, we all like the conferences and everything, and like, come on, just staying up and watching and live tweeting and everything, that's great. But I feel like E3 is always going to have a place. And I'm sure their attendance this year is down because PlayStation is not there. But I don't really think it's really something to worry about unless it's a continual, gradual decrease in the amount of attendees and the amount of vendors that show up. You get what I'm saying? But yeah, that's basically what I wanted to get on here and talk about. Just ramble on this whole subject of E3 and, is it relevant, is it not relevant, and yada, yada, yada. Speaking of E3, I know a lot of people have been asking me about this shirt right here. As you can see, this is from Dragon Quest 11. I actually got this when I went to E3 last year at the Square Enix booth. You played the demo, they gave you a free shirt. And this is pretty dope because I don't see too many Dragon Quest 11 merch, or just in general Dragon Quest merch in the States, because it's really big in Japan, but over here it's kind of like meow. Speaking of Dragon Quest, I feel like that's a topic for tomorrow. Oh yes. Anyways, from me to you for now, my name is NGS signing out. Like always, I will catch you guys later. Peace.